Corbyn!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister will absolutely welcome my first few questions because we're returning to his favourite subject of tax credits. Yesterday, one of his backbenchers said, and I quote, "Too many people would be adversely affected by the tax credit cuts. Something must give. For those of us proud enough to call ourselves compassionate Conservatives, it must not be on the backs of the working families we purport to serve." Where was she wrong?
The tax credit changes are part of a package, and a package that includes a higher national living wage and tax reductions. And I think that is the right approach for our country. Let's make work pay, let's allow people to earn more, let's cut their taxes, and let's make welfare affordable. And I'm delighted that once again this measure passed the House of Commons last night in a big majority.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Well, if the Prime Minister is keen on tax credits helping people into work, I've got a question for him from Lizette, who, I quote, says, "A lot of people are setting up their own businesses as self-employed, especially in rural areas where job vacancies are limited and pay is often low. Tax credits help them until their business becomes established. So cutting tax credits damages her life opportunities and the life opportunities of anyone she might employ. Does he not see the value of giving support to people trying to improve their lives rather than cutting their ability to survive properly?"
Of course we want to help the self-employed on low incomes, and that is why the people on the lowest incomes will continue to receive the child tax credit at £2,730. But there are other things we're doing to help the self-employed. We're cutting income tax. That helps the self-employed. We're introducing the employment allowance to cut the national insurance budget for the self-employed. That helps. But above all, what we're doing is creating an economy with 2 million more people in work, an economy that is growing, wages that are rising, and inflation that is at zero. And all these questions on tax credits, in a way, come back to the same point, which is how you build a strong and secure economy. And you don't do it on the back of a massive deficit and an ever-increasing debt, which is what Labour left us with.
This is all very strange because the Prime Minister seems to have changed his mind on this subject in a rather large way. John emailed me to say the Prime Minister solemnly declared on national television shortly before the last, yes, solemnly, and I'm solemn as well, shortly before the last general election that tax credits would not be affected. Is there any reason why this change has come about, or any reason why we should believe the Prime Minister on any assurances he gives in relation to tax credits?
What we said before the election is that we would reduce welfare by £12 billion as part of getting the deficit down, part of getting the economy growing, and part of creating 2 million jobs. That is what happened at the election, and we are keeping our promises by delivering that stronger economy. He talks about something strange happening. Something quite strange did happen last night. We had a vote on tax credits, and the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party didn't turn up. Can he explain that strange outing?
Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister cannot answer now on tax credits and the devastation that is doing.
Delighted at tax credit cuts.
Thank you. And the devastation that the cuts are taking on many people's lives, can I ask him to deal with another subject? That is the steel industry. Does he appreciate the devastating effects of the government's non-intervention in the steel industry are having on so many people? I've got a question from a maintenance fitter at the Tata Steelworks in Scunthorpe. He's helping to produce steel for Network Rail and many companies that were exporting it. He wants to know what the Prime Minister is going to do to support the steel industry and its workers who are now facing redundancy. Is it not time to walk the walk rather than talk the talk about an industrial strategy?
Look, we do want to help our steel industry, and we recognise, well, I will set out exactly how we will help the steel industry. It is in a very difficult situation. World prices have collapsed by more than half. The surplus capacity in the world is more than 50 times the UK output, but our plan is to take action in 4 vital areas: in procurement, in energy costs, in unfair competition and dumping, and in tax and government support. Now, honourable members opposite are saying, what have you done so far? Well, let me take one example. On procurement, we changed the procurement rules so it was easier to source UK steel, and that is why Crossrail, being completed, 26 miles of tunnels, the biggest construction project anywhere in Europe, is using almost exclusively British steel. That didn't happen under the last Labour government. It does happen now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the real problem the government doesn't actually have an industrial strategy to protect the most important industries we have in this country? If they had, they wouldn't have had to have been dragged kicking and screaming to this House 3 times in the last 8 days. Thousands of jobs have already gone at risk in Redcar, Scunthorpe, Rotherham, Motherwell, Cumberslang, Wrexham, and across the West Midlands. Isn't it time for concrete action today so that there is government intervention, there is support for our industry, and we do have a viable steel industry for the long term, which this country desperately needs to have?
We do want a strong and viable steel industry, and that means taking action across all of the areas that I mentioned. Let me mention another one: energy costs. We've already put £50 million into cutting energy costs, and our plans will mean hundreds of millions of pounds extra to cut energy costs. Now, honourable members opposite...
Order. I apologise for having to interrupt the Prime Minister. Mr Blenkinsop, a statesmanlike demeanour is what I would hope for from someone who served with distinction in the opposition whip's office. Calm yourself or take a sedative. Prime Minister.
So, on energy, we will have hundreds of millions more pounds saving. But I have to say to the Leader of the Opposition, last week in the House of Lords, the Labour Party voted to add to energy bills by opposing the measures we're taking on wind power. So yes, we do have a strategy, we do have a plan. We should be working across party to deliver that plan. I met with the Member of Parliament for Scunthorpe and the neighbouring MPs back in November last year to make sure we could take all of the action necessary, and across each of these areas, that's exactly what we'll do.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Well, he met the members 11 months ago to discuss the issue, and he's yet to go to the European Union to discuss how the British government could intervene to protect our industry. The final question I want to put to the Prime Minister comes from Louis, and this is deeply embarrassing to all of us in this House and indeed to this country as a whole. This country, the United Kingdom, is currently being investigated by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities because of allegations of grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights. This is very sad news indeed, but even more sad is the news that we need to be investigated because of some violations that have occurred. Will the Prime Minister commit now to cooperate fully with the inquiry and publish in full the government's response to this inquiry, so that we ensure people with disabilities are treated properly, legally, and given full respect and opportunities within our society?
First of all, let me just take up the honourable gentleman on the point he made about intervention in Europe. We have been doing this for months, making sure that we have proper action against dumping in the European Union, that we have taken the cases to the European Commission and will continue to do so. Now, on the issue of helping disabled people in our country, we've seen tens of thousands of more disabled people get into work under this government. Because of legislation passed by a previous Conservative government, we have some of the strongest equality legislation when it comes to disability anywhere in the world. Of course, I will look at any United Nations investigation, but sometimes when you look at these investigations, you find they are not necessarily all that they are originally cracked up to be. There are many disabled people in our world who don't have any of the rights or any of the support that they get here in Britain, and I think we should be proud of what we do as we cooperate with this report.
Debates that shape the nation, now in your language.
Jo Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Food bank use has risen by 1,665% since the Prime Minister took office in 2010. And in Cardiff Central, I meet people every week who rely on food banks to feed their families. Does the Prime Minister know how many more families will be relying on food banks as a result of his government's cuts to tax credits? And does he care?
Well, what is happening in her constituency is the number of people claiming unemployment benefit is down 20% in the last year. The youth claimant count has fallen almost 20% in the last year, and the long-term youth unemployment has fallen in the last year by 38%. That is what is happening. Of course, I don't want anyone in our country to have to rely on food banks, but the right answer is a growing economy, creating jobs, higher wages, the national living wage, and cutting taxes. That's what we're delivering, and that's how to help Britain's families.
McLaughlin.
Mr. Speaker, I represent a constituency of hard-working, decent people, and yet in the forgotten communities of Milton, Postle Park, Springburn, Germiston, Garngad, Royston, Black Hill, Rocasey and Hag Hill, child poverty lies at an astonishing 38.1%. I was going to ask if the Prime Minister was at all touched by the waves of compassion coming even from his own backbenches yesterday in the tax credit debate, but I think we've got the answer to that. So I will simply ask if he can offer a personal guarantee that no child in my constituency will be worse off a year from now.
The point I'd make to the Honourable Lady is that those poverty figures are after 20 years of the great tax credit experiment, and what we saw was an increase in the cost of tax credits and an increase in in-work poverty. We say it is time for a new approach. Higher pay, more jobs, lower taxes. And if we look at her constituency, in the last year, the claimant count has come down by 10%. If you compare it to the 2010 election, the number of people claiming unemployment benefit in her constituency is down 43%. I say, let's give people the chance of a job, of a salary, of a decent wage and lower taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given Russia's military expansion and given North Korea's development of a submarine-launched ballistic missile system that can strike the West, would the Prime Minister agree with me that this is no time to campaign for nuclear disarmament?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. I think it is right to maintain our independent nuclear deterrent, and anyone who has any doubts of it only has to look at the dangers and uncertainty in our world. And frankly, I think it is very disappointing for this country that for so long we had a consensus across party that the nuclear deterrent was right for Britain, and now we have a leader of the opposition who is campaigning with CND. Frankly, it's today that we're celebrating that great film, Back to the Future, and I'm not surprised that many people sitting behind him say he should get in his DeLorean and go back to 1985 and stay there.
Suella Fernandes.
Speaker, I recently visited the British Army Training Unit in Suffield in Canada, and I met many of...
Order. Scottish National Party members must calm themselves. The Honourable Lady is going to ask what I think might be her first Prime Minister's question. That question will be heard in full. Suella Fernandes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited the British Army Training Unit in Suffield in Canada and met many of our brave men and women undergoing advanced combat training, including my constituent, Major Ian Wallace of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Many of them support this government's commitment to spending the NATO target of 2% of our GDP on protecting Britain's interests. Will my right honourable friend please explain how that commitment will go towards investment in technology and equipment to enable people like Major Ian Wallace to do his job properly?
Well, first of all, let me thank Major Ian Wallace for the work that he does, and crucially, the 2% will make sure that all those who join our splendid armed forces in the coming years will know that they will have world-beating equipment and technology at their fingertips. I think that's a really important part of making sure we build strong morale in Britain's excellent armed forces.
Patricia Gibson.
Here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The operators of Hunterston Coal Terminal, Peel Ports Group in my constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran has announced significant redundancies. How will the Prime Minister work with the Peel Ports Group to explore alternative uses for the terminal, which is suitable for the imports and exports of a wide range of bulk solids and liquid products and offshore decommissioning?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right to raise this. Peel Ports is a company that we work very closely with in government because of the enormous amount of key infrastructure and land that they own. I will look carefully with the Secretary of State and with the devolved authorities to see if there's more we can do in this instance.
Rees-Mogg.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend share my concern that if the other place were to vote against working tax credits, this would be a serious challenge to the privilege of this House, a privilege codified as long ago as 1678? And does he further share my concern that this would then entitle him to review the decisions of Gray and Asquith in relation to creating more peers to ensure the government can get its financial business through?
I think my honourable friend makes an important point. His knowledge of history is clearly better than mine. I thought the key date was the 1911 Parliament Act, but clearly under that Act it's supposed to be that issues of finance are decided in this House. Now this House has now decided twice in favour of this measure, once when voting on the statutory instrument, again last night in a vote put forward by the opposition, and I think the House of Lords should listen to that very carefully and recognise that it's for this House to make financial decisions, it's for the other House to revise other legislation.
James Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extremism is one of the biggest social problems that we currently face in Britain. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that we need to redouble our efforts through the government's counter-extremism strategy to redouble our efforts to address this scourge of extremism in Britain?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, and that is why we've passed the prevent duty and put that duty on every public body in our country, on schools and colleges and universities. And the Home Secretary and I were in a school in Luton this week listening to teachers who said that's actually made a real difference, and referrals into the Channel programme are happening far more quickly because of the changes that we've made. Look, this is going to be the struggle of our generation, fighting extremism and recognising that we have to attack it before it becomes violent extremism. We have to undermine the awful narrative of victimhood and grievance which so many are using, which eventually leads to violence.
Dakin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did the Prime Minister make clear to the Chinese President the urgent need to stop Chinese steel dumping? And if so, what was the response? And will he meet once again with North Lincolnshire MPs to see what further can be done to support steel making in Scunthorpe?
Well, I'm glad that the honourable member was at the summit on Friday. I met with him back in November. Always happy to meet again with him and neighbouring MPs. When this question time finishes, I'm going straight to number 10 for several hours of talks with the Chinese President, and there's every opportunity to talk about this issue. I began those discussions last night, where I think the Chinese do recognise that they've got a huge overcapacity in their own steel industry, and that's an issue they have to address as well. But let me say again, I don't want to make promises I can't keep. We can't set the steel price here in this House. We can't set the steel price here in this House, and we can't go beyond the sorts of steps I've talked about on procurement, on energy, on industrial support. But let me just remind members opposite, they might like to remember something of their own record. Under Labour, steel production halved. Under Labour, employment in steel halved. Since I've been Prime Minister, steel production has gone up and steel employment has stayed at the same level. So before we get a self-righteous lecture from the party opposite, look at your own record.
First from Mr. Phil.
I suspect those cheers were for the Prime Minister rather than for me. Would the Prime Minister agree that one of the reasons why some steel plants have suffered difficulties is because wholesale electricity prices in this country are twice the level of Germany. And one of the reasons for that is that the former Labour Party leader, the member for Doncaster South, imposed a large number. Would he agree that the green taxes imposed by the last government are significantly responsible?
Order! We don't need to waste time with this. It's got nothing to do with government policy. Mr. Hywel Williams! Mr. Williams!
Thank you.
Order! Nothing to do with current government policy. Mr. Hywel Williams!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of people who installed cavity wall insulation now have damp, mouldy houses as the system fails and lets in rainwater. Many were misled that this was a government scheme and now find that the industry guarantee difficult to access and insufficient. Will the Prime Minister take a personal interest in this scandal to ensure that older and disabled people in particular are fully compensated and that further reputational damage to the government's energy conservation measures is averted?
I'll look very carefully at that issue because actually it goes to a larger point, which is that the obligations we put on energy companies do lead to higher prices. And this goes directly to the point that my honourable friend was quite rightly trying to ask. And even last week, the Labour Party in the House of Lords was voting to put up energy prices. That impacts steel users. So they ought to start trying to do the same thing in the House of Lords as in the House of Commons.
Order!
Debates that shape the nation, now in your language.